1998, Doctor Who's 35th year on the air. Over the past 3 years, viewers had gotten accustomed to the show's current style, with the 45-minute format and Bonneville's Ninth Doctor being openly accepted by the show's audience. 1998 would also see the series celebrating its 35th anniversary. And whilst there was no plans for a big special, with season 35 being business as usual, there was something planned for that year's upcoming Children in Need. Doctor Who's first official crossover. But who with? Season 35 of Doctor Who would have starred Hugh Bonneville as the Ninth Doctor, along with Beverly Cressman as Abigail Norwood. It would also see Lynn Grant acting as producer, with Gary Russell as script editor. Season 35 would see the debut of the new producer, Lynn Grant, the first female producer since Verity Lambert in 1963. Unlike her more recent predecessors, Grant wouldn't be as hands-on as a producer and left most of the creative involvement and development to Gary Russell, who was more well acquainted with the show and its mythos. The pair were happy with the show's current direction of having more stories set on other worlds or Earth's past or future, and following heavily in Star Trek's paths, although Gary Russell wished to start including more fan-pleasing elements into the show. Season 35 would mark Doctor Who's 35th anniversary on the air. However, fans would be disappointed to learn that, much like 10 years prior, there would be no big special to mark the choral anniversary. However, it was announced that a 10-minute short was being produced to mark the anniversary, which would air on that year's Children in Need. This would also be the final season for Beverly Cressman as Abigail Norwood, who was now being offered roles elsewhere and chose to leave the show to pursue these options. Season 35 would air between the 4th of July 1998 and the 19th of September 1998. It would consist of 12 episodes across 7 stories, with 2 single-parters and 5 two-parters, and would go out weekly on Saturday night. This story sees the Doctor and Abigail accidentally landing on the planet Archetrix, where they interrupt a meeting between the Time Lords and 19 other races, the only races in the universe who have developed time travel. However, Coordinator Van Cell of the Gallifreyan CIA vouches for them, and the meeting continues, where it's revealed that strange things are happening. We learn that 20 years ago, Ytra Prime, the oldest planet in the universe, vanished from time and space, which took 500 scientists, mostly from Gallifrey, including the Lady President Romana. A year later, 300 of them reappeared on Archetrix, dead and distorted by time. To avert an accusation and a war, Archetrix agreed to host this conference, which has now come to fruition. However, Romana is still to be found. Now the Archetrians have detected that Ytra Prime has returned and is on a collision course with Archetrix, and it becomes obvious to everyone that those responsible for all of this is none other than the Daleks. The story then sees the Doctor investigating, where he discovers that the Daleks have planted mind-controlled agents on Archetrix, who proceed to destroy the planet's shields, allowing the Daleks to invade. The Doctor proceeds to reactivate the planet's defences, where he's eventually reunited with Romana, who reveals that she was being held prisoner by the Daleks on Ytra Prime for 20 years, but was able to escape. We then see the Doctor, Abigail and Romana returning to Gallifrey, where they discover a Dalek force beginning an invasion. We eventually learn that the reason why Ytra Prime was removed from time and space was so that the Daleks could mine particles from within the planet, known as the Apocalypse element, which they've proceeded to unleash on the Seraphia galaxy. The Doctor and Romana attempt to use the power of the Eye of Harmony to contain the element, but this plan fails. The Daleks on Gallifrey, however, add their own mental energy to the Eye, which contains the element. Eventually, however, the Daleks are defeated by the Doctor and Gallifrey. However, the Daleks detonate the element in the Seraphia galaxy, which destroys everything within it. It's also revealed by the dying Supreme Dalek that they've created a new galaxy that's 4 times the size of the Milky Way, and home to 600 billion stars, which will allow the Daleks to establish a power base and transform it into their new empire. This story begins with the Doctor and Abigail in the TARDIS control room, discussing an off-screen encounter with Jane Austen, whilst the Doctor's tinkering with the TARDIS controls. Suddenly the console room shakes, as if something has crashed into the TARDIS. The lights turn red and a cloister bell echoes throughout the ship, as the Doctor frantically works at the console. He proceeds to pull 4 levers down simultaneously, which causes the red lights to turn off, but also dims all light across the TARDIS as the engines go silent. The Doctor explains to Abigail that they briefly got caught in a black hole. They were able to escape the black hole by using an emergency shift, which saved them at the cost of the TARDIS's power and shield protection. However, he reveals that they can restore these by travelling to a generator room deep within the TARDIS. We then see the pair travelling through the bowels of the TARDIS, looking for the generator room. However, we also see a POV shot of something, or someone, observing the Doctor and Abigail through a hidden camera. This unknown entity laughs as it begins to shift the TARDIS corridors around, trapping and separating the Doctor and Abigail in never-ending loops, and moving them closer towards dangerous rooms, such as an exposed furnace and a room full of man-eating gorillas. It turns out that a space parasite, known as a Raleigh, has taken control of the TARDIS, and has only been able to do so due to the shields being lowered. We learn that Raleigh has full control over the TARDIS, and plans to fly the ship directly into an exploding sun. We then see the Doctor and Abigail racing against time, as they try to reunite with each other, as well as navigating a never-ending landscape, and trying to find the generator room before they boil to death. Eventually they're able to find the generator room, where they're able to restore the ship's power and re-raise the shields, which forcefully ejects Raleigh from the TARDIS and restores the corridors back to normal. The pair then sprint back to the control room, where the Doctor works frantically around the console to dematerialise the TARDIS before it floats into the sun. This story sees the Doctor and Abigail arriving on Mondas, some time before its return to the solar system, something which the Doctor is initially unaware of. We see Mondas to be a big industrial metal city, buried underneath a roof of steel and metal. The pair then split up and explore the city, where Abigail meets a young woman named Yvonne Hartley and her father, known simply as Mr. Hartley. She discovers Mr. Hartley to have some kind of cybernetic chess piece which has been damaged, however she's able to fix it. The two thank Abigail and offer to take her in for the night, as nighttime is approaching and curfew is in place. Arriving at the household, the group are met with Sister Man Constant, a public sector nurse. She asks Abigail who she is, but Abigail stands up to her questioning and sends her firmly on her way. Abigail meets Yvonne's brother, Frank, as well as seeing that the Hartley family, and nearly everyone else on Mondas, is living in the darkness. Abigail is invited to dine with the family, however she's forced to leave early when Sister Man Constant and a group of Cybermen officers raid the household. The Doctor meanwhile meets a man named Thomas Dodd, who is a dealer in body parts for money. Through some brief conversation, the Doctor learns that he's on Mondas, just as the Cybermen are beginning to evolve. We eventually see the Doctor reuniting with Abigail, where he explains to Abigail about Mondas and the people of this world's future. Initially, the Doctor says that they can't interfere in the upcoming events and must let the people of Mondas pave their own future. However, when he realises that the genesis of the Cybermen is happening now, he's unable to resist not interfering and attempts to warn the locals about what's happening. The story then sees the pair working with Mr. Hartley to try and stop the genesis of the Cybermen. We also see that Yvonne has been selected for the Cyberman programming and, unaware of the dangers, agrees to be taken away, where she's converted into a Cyberman. However, before her emotions can be inhibited, a power flux causes her conversion to stop, where she proceeds to return to her family home. Frank and Mr. Hartley try to comfort her, however the power soon turns back on, which ends up killing Yvonne. Eventually, the Doctor is arrested and captured by one of the Cybermen's creators, Dr. Manallen, who discovers the Doctor to be an alien. She then attaches the Doctor to a machine, which uses him as a template to improve further Cybermen, meaning that part of the Doctor will be a part of every Cyberman he's ever met and will meet. Eventually, now working alongside Dr. Manallen, the Doctor, Abigail, and a group of allies are able to save the people of Mondas by destroying the Central Committee, a hive mind of 20 individuals which ruled Mondas. The story ends with the Doctor and Abigail leaving Mondas, believing that their actions may have altered history. However, the story ends by cutting back to Mondas, where we see that the first Cyber leader survived and forces Dr. Man Allen to restart the conversion process. This story would have been set in Norfolk in 1914, where we see the Doctor living the life of a history teacher named John Smith, who seemingly believes himself to be just a normal human. We learn that the Doctor's chosen to turn himself human in an attempt to explore the human condition and better understand his companions. Using a fictional persona designed by the TARDIS's databanks, the Doctor's turned himself into a human named John Smith and plans to live in 1914 for 3 months, with the Doctor's Gallifreyan life being stored in the biodata pod, which Abigail has hidden in the tree. Abigail meanwhile has taken residence in the nearby town, where she gets to know the townspeople, including a young suffragette named Constance. We see Smith teaching history, as well as helping out a bullied student named Timothy. We also see Smith beginning to take an interest and befriending another teacher named Joan Redfern. For the first 9 weeks all goes fine. However, trouble begins to emerge when a race of aliens arrive. We see the aliens to be a race of shapeshifters known as the Orbitide, who can shapeshift into the appearance of anyone and anything they eat. The Orbitide plan to extract the Doctor's biodata in order to gain the ability to regenerate. With this ability, the Orbitide will be able to create new family members who will also be able to regenerate, and they'll soon be able to conquer Gallifrey. We initially see one of the Orbitide, named Green Eye, attempting to get Abigail to reveal the location of the Doctor's biodata by pretending to be the Doctor's next incarnation. However, Abigail isn't easily tricked. Realising the danger they're in, Abigail attempts to convince Smith about his identity, although he refuses to believe her. Abigail then attempts to retrieve the biodata pod, but discovers that it's missing. We learn that Timothy has found and taken the pod for himself. We also see the data from the pod leaking into Timothy, who begins to take on the physical and mental characteristics of a Time Lord, such as gaining a respiratory bypass system and Venusian Aikido. The story sees Smith working alongside Abigail and Joan to find the data pod and save the Doctor, as well as finding a way to defeat the Orbitide. During this, we would see Smith confess his love to Joan, as well as going so far as to propose to her. Eventually, the group find Timothy in the biodata pod. Smith begins to question what he should do next, when he has a vision of his first love, Verity, who is in fact an aspect of the TARDIS, placed in his mind to protect those parts of the Doctor's psyche which could not be completely erased from his mind. He now knows who he really is. Whether the Doctor or John Smith, he is never cruel or cowardly, and is a man of peace, even in times of war. At peace with himself, Smith uses the pod to change back into the Doctor, and the Doctor, pretending to be Smith still, takes the pod to the Orbitide and hands it over to an Orbitide named August. August attempts to harvest the biodata, which then mentally transforms him into Smith. Smith then sacrifices his life in order to save Joan, and the Doctor traps the Orbitide using the time barrier. The Doctor bids Smith farewell, saying that he did a fine job, before he proceeds to set the Orbitide's equipment to self-destruct, before he and Joan escape. We then end with the Doctor speaking to Joan, having been aware of how much she and Smith were in love. Joan is upset to learn that Smith died for her, but she must accept that. Although the Doctor remembers his experiences, he isn't Smith and can't go back to being him, not even for her. This story would follow a woman named Sally Sparrow in the year 1999. We see her investigate a strange house at night, where she finds the garden to be filled with strange stone statues. She finds a message written under some old wallpaper addressed to her, telling her to beware the weeping angels. She tears away the rest of the wallpaper to see the end of the message. Don't blink. Love from the Doctor, 1969. Following this, Sally travels to her friend's house, Kathy Nightingale, where she meets her brother Larry, who's watching a VHS recording of the Doctor, talking seamlessly nonsense to the camera. The following day, Sally and Kathy go back to the house to do some further investigation. There, Sally notices that the statues appear to have moved, as well as finding one of them holding a key. Kathy begins to explore upstairs where, unbeknownst to Sally, she's touched by an angel, zapping her back to the 1920s. Sally then hears a knock at the door. She opens it up where she meets a man who tells her that he was instructed to deliver a parcel to this exact house in this exact moment in time to Sally Sparrow. He also reveals that he was instructed to do so by his grandmother, Kathy Nightingale. Upon opening the parcel, she finds a series of old photos of Kathy living through the 1920s to 1990s, as well as a letter to Sally, saying that she'll be dead by the time she reads this, and to give her love to her brother Larry. Sally heads to Larry's work, a video renting place, where he finds him still watching the video of the Doctor. Larry explains that the recording is an Easter egg which appears at the end of 17 different films on VHS, and no one, not even the manufacturers or the publishers, knows how it got there. This Easter egg being the Doctor sitting in front of a camera and making random remarks, as if we're only hearing half of a conversation. Larry gives Sally a list of all 17 films before leaving. Following on from this, Sally goes to the police to see if there's been any other strange cases involving the house. There she meets a police officer named Billy Shipton, who both take a liking to each other. Billy then shows Sally a collection of cars which were abandoned outside the house, as well as the crown jewel of the collection, an old police box. He says it's presumably a fake, and that it can't be opened. Billy then charms Sally into giving him her number before she leaves. However, after she leaves, Billy finds the stone angel statues from the house surrounding the police box and filling the room. We see Billy blink before cutting to blackness. We then cut to Billy in a dark alley at night where he's approached by two people, the Doctor and Abigail Norwood. They explain that he's now in the year 1969, that he was touched by a weeping angel, a creature that looks like a statue that, if it touches you, zaps you back to the past, with the angels feeding off the energy of the days that never were, which is also how they ended up in 1969. The Doctor then tells Billy that he needs him to deliver a message to Sally, but that it's going to take a very long time to do so. Cutting back to the present, we see Sally receiving a phone call from an unknown caller, who tells her to meet them in the nearby hospital. Going to the hospital, she finds Billy, much older and weaker. There, Billy explains what's happened to him and how he ended up marrying another woman named Sally, but also reveals that he was the one who put the Easter egg on those 17 films, before telling Sally to look at the list of 17 VHSs and says that they all have something in common. We then see Sally staying with Billy in his final hours, as he's revealed he is soon to die, before heading off back to the house, now realising what the tapes have in common. Sally phones Larry to meet at the old house and to bring a VHS with the Easter egg on it, as well as a VCR and working TV, whilst also revealing that the list is of every VHS she owns. Larry eventually arrives and they turn on the Easter egg. There we discover the Doctor in the Easter egg has been talking to Sally all this time, since he's from the future and has a manuscript of everything Sally will say and does say. Larry begins to write down what Sally is saying, which the Doctor reveals is what he's reading off. He explains the weeping angels to the duo, explaining that they can only move when they aren't being observed, as well as explaining the phone box is his TARDIS and that the angels now have it. When the video ends, the two of them are surrounded by a swarm of angels. They make their way to the basement where they find the TARDIS. They unlock the TARDIS and get inside just before an angel can touch them. Inside, a hologram recording of the Doctor instructs the duo to pull a series of levers and insert a VHS into the console. The duo do so and the TARDIS begins to take off. However, to their horror, the TARDIS is leaving them behind. We see the walls fade away as they're replaced by the basement and the angels surrounding the duo. They huddle together before realising that they're actually safe. The Doctor tricked the angels into surrounding the TARDIS, which, when it vanished, caused the angels to look at each other, meaning they'll never move again. The story then ends by jumping 1 year later, with Sally and Larry now running a bookshop as a couple. We see Sally making recordings of her encounter with the angels, after realising she never learned how the Doctor knew all about Sally and the angels. She then spies the Doctor from outside her shop, and rushes after him, only to discover that he doesn't know who she is, causing her to realise that it's still in the Doctor's future, and that it was her who set the whole thing into motion. She then hands him the folder containing all of the information around the angels, as well as explaining what's going to happen to him. This story sees the TARDIS arriving on the Hotel Galaxies around Earth's orbit in the year 2136, where the Doctor and Abigail discover the entire station has been booked for a murder mystery weekend. The story initially sees the Doctor and Abigail pretending to be here for the games and going along with the murder mystery. However, the group soon discovers that real murder is being committed, forcing the Doctor and Abigail to investigate. It turns out that a race of shark-like aliens, known as the Celestians, are responsible. We discovered that the Celestians are in search of a weapon in the form of an artificial intelligence program that could turn all networked computer systems against the user's assigned target. We then see the weapon being programmed to kill Abigail, who's captured by the Celestians and taken back to their ship. However, the Doctor is able to travel to the Celestian ship and rescue Abigail in the TARDIS. The story then ends with the weapon backfiring on the Celestians as it blows up their ship, still believing Abigail to be on board. The Doctor also reveals that with the weapon still programmed to track down Abigail, she'll never be able to return to the year 2136, and that the weapon would eventually delete itself as the means of controlling it had been lost. This story begins with the Doctor and Abigail in the TARDIS control room when they're caught off guard by the sound of someone or something banging on the TARDIS doors. The Doctor turns on the scanner and sees a person in a spacesuit banging on the doors in a panic. Quickly, the Doctor hops to the other side of the console and opens the doors, where he proceeds to dash open to the doors and pull in the spaceman. Carrying him over to the nearby chairs, he removes the spaceman's helmet. He throws it to the side and looks in surprise at the man behind the mask, seemingly recognizing him. He tells Abigail that this is Harkson, the Prince of the Galaxies. He goes on to explain that his family, known in this part of the universe as the Galactic family, are essentially the royal family of England from the very far future. Harkson asks the Doctor to bring him back to his family planet, the Galactic planet, and notes that Abigail is the spitting image of his sister, Catherine, the Princess of the Galaxies, who is soon to be crowned Queen. The Doctor proceeds to pilot the TARDIS to the Galactic planet, when he and Abigail meet the Galactic family, including Harkson's father-in-law, Lord Maestra, played by Nathaniel Parker. They also get to meet his sister, who, true to Harkson's word, looks identical to Abigail. Maestra thanks the Doctor and Abigail for saving him and invites the pair to dine with them. We then see the Doctor and Abigail at a royal banquet, where they dine with the rest of the Galactic family. We see Maestra keeping a close eye on the Doctor for some reason. The Doctor can sense this, but he isn't too sure what to make of it. We also see Abigail and Catherine getting on extremely well. After dinner, Catherine offers to show Abigail around the palace, which she accepts. We see the pair exploring a grand hallway, where Catherine opens up to Abigail about how she doesn't want to be queen just yet, and wants to explore the universe. This gives the pair an idea to swap places, with Abigail posing as the princess, and Catherine posing as the Doctor's companion. The two then secretly swap clothes and reunite with the Doctor and the rest of the Galactic family. At which point, the Doctor tells Catherine, who he believes to be Abigail, that they should be heading off now. The family and Abigail wave goodbye to the Doctor and Catherine, with Abigail and Catherine giving each other winks. The story then focuses on Abigail, as we see her attending her coronation and is crowned Queen of the Galaxies. We then see her at another royal banquet, where she, Harkson and the Galactic family dine with a swarm of people. However, Abigail and Harkson begin to notice that everyone around them is falling asleep. Abigail checks the new princess and realizes that everyone but them has been drugged. Suddenly, the palace is raided by space pirates, who fight off the few remaining active guards and hold Abigail as hostage. Abigail calls for Harkson to help her, when Harkson joins arms with the space captain, revealing himself to be the grand orchestrator behind this attack. The group then proceeds to kidnap Abigail and lock her away in the ancient dungeons. Abigail asks Harkson what he's doing, to which Harkson says he's seeking the glory he deserves. He reveals to Abigail that legally, he should have been the heir to the throne. However, because his parents always favoured Catherine, they chose her to be the queen. He reveals that he has allied himself with a total genius to form an elaborate plan which will trick the people of the galactic planet into believing the queen has been assassinated, which will allow him to become king. Abigail asks who this genius is, and out of the shadows emerges Maestra. Maestra says, "Hello, Miss Norwood," seemingly being able to tell that she is Abigail. Maestra explains that by switching places with Catherall, Abigail has made his job a lot easier. With the docks out of the way, he now has free reign to control the galaxy with his accomplice, revealing that he isn't actually Harkson's father-in-law, but merely in his body. Abigail then asks Maestra who exactly he is, to which he replies with, "I am the Master, and you will obey me, Miss Norwood." We then cut back to the docks and Catherall in the TARDIS. Catherall, still posing as Abigail, tunes the TARDIS's scanner into the news outlet for the galactic planet, which reveals that the Queen is dead and Harkson is to be crowned in her place. Catherall begins to tear up and well up before revealing her true identity to the Doctor and how she switched places with Abigail. The Doctor is beyond furious with Abigail and says that thanks to her, his best friend is now dead. However, the two begin to wonder whether Abigail is really dead when Harkson tells the news that he was seemingly spared by the assassins. Catherall says she's always known about Harkson's desire to be king, and how cunning and ruthless he can be to get his way, and believes that there might be a chance that Abigail is being kept alive somewhere as insurance. The story then sees the Doctor and Catherall returning to the galactic planet in search of Abigail. However, they're quickly found and captured by the space pirates. They're taken to their ship where the Master awaits them. The Doctor questions the Master, still believing him to be Maestra, as to why he is helping the pirates. The Master breaks his character, teasing the Doctor to try and work out who he is. And after a few moments, it hits the Doctor as he realises who this actually is. The Doctor, anger under his breath, asks the Master what he's done with Abigail, to which he tells him not to worry, that Abigail is alive and safe. For now. The Master explains his grand plan to the Doctor, explaining that with Harkson as king, he will be granted free reign to conquer and enslave a quarter of the galaxy in exchange for his help in getting Harkson crowned king. The Master then tells the Doctor that as much as he'd like to stay and catch up on old times, he really must go as there's a coronation to attend. He then activates a teleport device and zaps himself away, with the Doctor being taken to the brig. There he's able to see the coronation underway on the TV. We also cut to the Master speaking with Harkson, telling him that the Doctor has returned and that they must speed up their plans. We then see the Doctor and Catherall coming face to face with the captain of the pirates, and asks what he's getting out of working with a man as untrustworthy as the Master. He explains that they've been promised riches beyond their imagination by the Master, and that the two of them will be sold off into slavery. However, the Doctor is able to convince the pirates to work with them when they convince them that the Master is an unstable ally and will betray them the second he has the chance to. The pirates then agree to help find Abigail after Catherall reveals herself to be the Queen and explains that she'll pardon them of their crimes if she's reinstated. The pirates lead the pair to the dungeons where they find and rescue Abigail. They then return to the TARDIS where, after Abigail is washed up and fitted with new clothes, proceed to raid the church where Harkson is to be crowned, where they reveal that Catherall is still alive and expose Harkson and the Master's plan to rule the galaxy as dictators. Catherall states that she is queen and orders her men to arrest the pair. A fight breaks out in the church, the pirates fighting the Master's hypnotised royal guards, and the Doctor fighting Harkson in a sword fight, which the Doctor eventually wins. The Master then pulls out his TCE device from under his royal robes, where he proceeds to aim it at the Doctor and opens fire. Catherall sees the Master doing so and pushes the Doctor out of harm's way, which results in her dying and being shrunk. Harkson pauses and turns, seeing his sister dead on the ground. He tries to attack the Master, saying that he broke the truce, before the Master also kills him. And now, with the Master outgunned and outnumbered, he's surrounded by the pirates and non-hypnotised guards, who capture and drag him away, with the Master ordering them to release him. With the fight over, a crowd gathers around the bodies of Harkson and Catherall. Or is it Catherall? No one, not even the Doctor, is sure as to whether this was Abigail or Catherall. The Doctor looks at Abigail in fear and asks, "Abigail?" She nods and quietly responds with, "Abigail." The Doctor sighs with relief before hugging her. The Royal Guard captain then asks Abigail which one she is. Abigail pauses for a moment, unsure as to what she'll say next. She turns and looks back at the Doctor, before turning to face the guard. She clears her throat and replies with, "I am Catherall. I'm afraid it was Miss Norwood who perished in the fight." We then end with the Doctor asking Abigail what she's doing, still claiming to be Catherall to the people of the planet. Abigail says that she couldn't bear to tell the people that their princess, now queen, is actually dead. The Doctor then asks what they're going to do now. Abigail sighs before telling the Doctor, "I think it's time." She says that the people of this world don't have a suitable leader and will probably collapse without one. So, in order to keep the world stable, she must leave the Doctor to assume the identity of Catherall. The two of them hug and say their goodbyes, with the Doctor telling Abigail that she'll make an excellent queen and that he promises to visit her in the future. The two then proceed to walk their separate ways, with Abigail walking right back into the palace and the Doctor walking left back to the TARDIS. We follow the Doctor as he enters the TARDIS and walks over to the console. He turns on the scanner and watches as Abigail wipes a tear from her eye before proceeding to walk into the palace and closing the grand doors behind her. The Doctor rubs his eye before turning off the scanner and proceeds to take off in the TARDIS, alone. On the 13th of November 1998, the BBC aired a 10-minute crossover event between Doctor Who and the BBC Two sci-fi comedy series Red Dwarf. As well as being a mini crossover event between the BBC's biggest sci-fi shows, the special was seen, in a mostly unofficial capacity, as the landmark for Doctor Who's 35th anniversary. The special would have been set on board Starbug, the main shuttlecraft used by Red Dwarf in seasons 6 and 7. Hugh Bonneville and Beverly Cressman would star as the Doctor and Abigail Norwood, with the Red Dwarf cast consisting of Chris Barry as Rimmer, Craig Charles as Lister, Denny John Jules as the Cat, and Robert Llewellyn as Crichton. It was originally planned for Chloe Annette to star in the special, however due to Annette's involvement in both Doctor Who and Red Dwarf, and not wishing to make things confusing, it was decided that the special would be set during season 6 and early season 7 of Red Dwarf, when Chris Barry was still a regular on the show. The story would see the TARDIS arriving on Starbug, where the Doctor and Abigail meet the crew. However, the two groups are forced to work together when they discover a polymorph, a creature from Red Dwarf that can shapeshift and steal a person's negative emotions, has snuck on board Starbug. We then see the cast searching through the corridors of Starbug in search of the polymorph, as it begins to pick off the crew one by one, including turning the Doctor into a bumbling geek. The polymorph is then defeated by Abigail, who uses a bazookoid, a laser gun from Red Dwarf, to blow up the polymorph and return the rest of the cast back to normal. Season 35, although on par with previous seasons in terms of viewing figures, was a smash hit with those who tuned in and would have been considered one of the show's best seasons, with half of the stories in this season being considered all-time classics. The same, however, couldn't be said for Doctor and the Bug, which garnered mixed to negative reviews from fans. Whilst it would have its defenders as anything, to say it was disliked by either the Doctor Who or Red Dwarf fan base would be an understatement. Despite that hiccup, however, 1998 would have been a successful year for Doctor Who, and the production team hoped to ride this success into the next season, Season 36.